I liked to imagine this family like working really, really hard to stave off the social change that was coming in, both from the people who worked for them and from some of the younger members of their own family.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation, in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
Hey, Ethan.
Hi, Mitch.
Ethan Shanty is with us. He's in the studio. Actually, he's not physically with us at the moment. He's physically with you because he's recording this, and I am sitting among the shirts and pants and jackets and stuff in the walk-in closet studio at my home office today, which is probably an image you didn't need going into this interview. But
I think people
anyway,
like to have a sense of place.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ethan Shanty is our producer, and he joins us at the beginning of these interviews to help set the table for us. Ethan, do you judge a book by its cover?
I don't judge a book by its cover. I judge a book by the content therein, but I don't get very far before I decide whether or not I'm going to read the whole thing. It only takes me one sentence to determine whether or not I'm going to finish a book. And we had a conversation last week about how, normally I'll give a book a couple of chapters, like 30, 40 pages to really let me give the author a chance to tell the story to me before I give up. But then as I got thinking about it more, I realized no, it's the first sentence for me, because I realized when I was editing this magazine, I will not name the magazine, that I had been tasked with, alongside several other editors, we had this open submission period, right? And Mitch, I don't know if you've ever edited a magazine, but we got something like 500 submissions for this little tiny, just like not even like a quarterly just like a yearly magazine. And so I was tasked with reading about 150 stories. But what I learned is obviously I don't have time to read 150 short stories by myself. So I was like, okay, I'll give it the first page. And then I realized, why am I giving it the first page? Because if the first sentence doesn't blow me away, then that kind of tells me that the author hasn't put a ton of work into what follows that.
Right, like the whole idea is to keep the reader reading after the first sentence.
Yeah, and if the first one doesn't blow me away, then it might be a rocky road here.
It's a lot of pressure on subject-verb agreement.
But both of us read for pleasure, and we have read lots and lots of books, and the first sentence is just so important.
We got to talking about this the other day, and that got me digging through my home library just to see if this idea was borne out in reality, because I haven't always paid attention. But I know it's something that my wife feels really strongly about, and so I went back and I was looking at some of the books that I've enjoyed over the years, and really, it's true. The books that I have enjoyed most tend to have sentences at the top of the book that really hooked me from the get-go.
Yeah, and so I know that you did this as well, but I started looking at some of the books that I've enjoyed to see if their first sentences really held up, and I found this one from anytime I have an opportunity, I'm going to talk about Stephen King, so I'm not going to resist that urge this time either. But he wrote this series called The Dark Tower. It's this series of 8 books, and the sentence that starts the very first book is, "The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed." And I think that's just such a delicious, efficient opening sentence, because it tells you who the two main characters are going to be. You don't necessarily know who's the protagonist and who's the antagonist yet, but you know where you are and you know the action that's occurring. From that first sentence, I just have to know more about it.
And likewise, I have on my lap actually a book that I haven't read in quite a few years, but it was a really amazing novel when I read it, and of course now that it's sitting on my lap, I want to go back and reread it, right, even though it is how many pages? About 500, but like a good Stephen King novel. but it's The Art of Fielding by Chad Harbach,
Okay.
which takes place at a small Midwestern college on the baseball team, and I connected with it. It's a very literary book. There are lots of Herman Melville references throughout the book. In fact, the college baseball team is called the Harpooners, in honor of Melville and Moby Dick. But the first sentence, as I see, this is a good sound effect as I open the book to the first sentence. Schwartz didn't notice the kid during the game.
Ooh, that's awesome.
And yeah, it's got a million great sentences after that. I went actually, so I was talking about this with my wife, who recalled a book she just read more recently called Fountain of Silence, or Fountains of Silence by Ruta Sepetys, which I think takes place during the Spanish Civil War, maybe World War I. Anyway, I went and looked at the first line, and it was simply, "They stood in line for blood."
Wow. That's so
Yeah.
excellent.
And now I kind of want to read it.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Yeah, because the power of that first sentence, it tells you everything that you need to know about the content of the book, I think. That's what a first sentence should do. Like it should prime you. It should make you curious. It should do a little bit of foreshadowing. The first sentence has to do so much. And I'm so glad that Book Talk exists and that there are so many new books that are being published. But I wonder sometimes how strict the editorial process is, because I've opened a lot of books and been pretty dismayed by what I found, which is not to say that I'm like the best writer or whatever, but writing a book can't just be an activity for you. Let me rephrase that a little bit. Writing and publishing a book cannot just be an activity for you. Writing on your own is super fun, very pleasurable. I get a lot of joy out of it. But if you're going to put something out into the world, you have to ensure that the person who's picking it up, who doesn't know you, who's never met you, has to be in from the jump.
Well, this is why the Bulwer-Lytton contest exists. Are you familiar with the Bulwer-Lytton contest?
Is that so? I know about the contest to write the worst opening sentence.
That's exactly
That's
what
it is. Okay, yeah.
Named for Edward Bulwer-Lytton, and he was, of course, the guy who started a novel with "It Was a Dark and Stormy Night."
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So I do know that contest. Yeah. That's of course why it exists. And man, what a fun contest that must be to try to come up with the worst, most purple opening sentence of a novel. So the reason we're talking about this is because you wanted to revisit this conversation that you had with the author of The God of the Woods,
Liz Moore. And you have recently just started reading it, have you not?
Right. And the reason that we're going back to it is because I've been hearing from a lot of people in book clubs that they're picking up this book for the first time, and it's not a brand new book. And my partner Aaron also picked it up as an audiobook, and then I know another person who picked it up independently. So The God of the Woods by Liz Moore seems to be in the zeitgeist right now. And so I was like, well, I know that Mitch had read this, and I wondered if he had a physical copy. And so Mitch lent it to me, and I was thinking about that. Is the first sentence going to really hook me? And I opened it up to the first page, and the first sentence is, "The bed is empty." And I was like, whoa, that's fantastic, because I know right away, I don't know exactly where I am, but I know that the conflict is built upon this thing which should not be. The bed is empty. And I was just like, cool. I know that this book is going to entertain me at the very least. And I've only read the first chapter. That's all I had an opportunity to get into. But I know that I'm going to enjoy it.
The God of the Woods, of course, came out last year. It's set in the North Country at a great camp. And it had some controversy. Controversy is maybe the wrong word, but it paints a very, I guess, nuanced, some people might say, negative picture of some aspects of the North Country. It's set in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I found it a really compelling read, partly because it's just quickly paced and an interesting story. I reached out to Liz Moore to talk with her last year. She has some North Country connections. We had a really interesting conversation, and so let's listen back to that now. Liz Moore, welcome to Northwards.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm really delighted to be here.
All right, so let's start by setting up your regional bona fides, if we could. This is a really familiar setting in this book to probably everyone here in the North Country, but what is your historic connection to this region?
Sure, yeah. On my mother's side, I had four ancestors who moved to the Southern Adirondacks in the early 1800s and settled in a community on the banks of the Sacandaga River. And they were there to be farmers. So our, family lore, and then I did a little bit of ancestral research as I was writing this, says that they started two farms, two separate farms there. And they did okay. The land was actually pretty fertile because it was near the banks of the Sacandaga. But then, as many of your listeners probably already know, the public works project that created the Sacandaga Reservoir in the early 1900s came along, thus displacing my ancestors and causing my grandmother and my mother to be raised just south of the Adirondacks. But my grandparents built a cabin in the woods nearby, and that's a place that we have been going as a family since the 60s. And now I bring my own kids there. And so I have spent many, many, many hours, days, weeks, months in the Adirondacks.
Well, and presumably,
I live in Philadelphia now, by the way. I don't live in the Adirondacks.
presumably, though, because you keep coming up, there is something that draws you to this place.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of, I still have cousins in the area. So, and my grandmother and lived in the area until she died. But I love it myself, as an individual. It's hugely important to me. It's a place where I find that my creativity is at its peak. I wrote large swaths of this book and actually all my books in the Adirondacks, in the cabin, but also, at various public libraries, at a couple of coffee shops nearby. And it's just a place that's so significant to me and to my creative imagination.
But to be clear, I think I know the answer to this, but your family's property and your Adirondack experience is probably nothing like the Van Laars that we read about in the book.
Yes, thank you for making that clarification. Our cabin was actually built by hand by my grandparents, who were not particularly, qualified. They had help from a family member who was more qualified than they were, but it is a cabin, a very modest cabin that is nothing like the mansion in the wilderness that the Van Laar family has constructed for themselves, which is more along the lines of the famous Adirondack Great Camps built in the region in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah. So what set you on the path to telling this particular story?
Yeah, well, for those who haven't encountered the book, should I set it up a little bit?
Yeah, if you would.
So, The God of the Woods is the story of the Van Laar family, who are a wealthy family who build what amounts to a mansion in the wilderness, a great camp. Just down the hill from there, they build a summer camp that they found with the purpose of educating the children of the wealthy in survival skills. In the summer of 1975, the Van Laar family sends their own 13-year-old daughter, Barbara, to the summer camp on their summer property, which they've never done before. And very quickly, she goes missing from the camp. But the catch is that she's not the first child of theirs to have gone missing, because 14 years earlier, their son also went missing from the same grounds, although not the summer camp. And so the question is sort of, what happened to both children? Did two separate forces cause them to disappear? Was it the same force? Was it someone in the family? Was it someone from the local community, which is predominantly working class and which serves the Van Laars personally and professionally? And so, yeah, that's the story of the God of the Woods. In large part, my inspiration came from my own family history in the region and the many, many hours that I've spent there, and all the kind of sensory details that I'm able to gather just by being in the woods in that place. But also, I would say a couple of secondary sources of inspiration were the real life serial killer, Robert Garrow, who will be familiar to many of your listeners, I'm sure, especially if they remember the 1970s in the Adirondacks. I think every family with an Adirondack connection or who lived in the Adirondacks probably has a near miss story with Robert Garrow, and my own family does as well. My uncle likes to tell one. My father, although he's not local to the Adirondacks. He married into the family, loved to tell us kind of like spooky stories about Garrow as we were kids, like to kind of frighten us about who could be lurking in the wilderness.
Did that work?
To a certain extent, I do have to say, I'm not at all a person who feels frightened by the wilderness. I feel sort of at home in the woods, and I always have. But the book begins with an epigraph by Anne Labastille, who I love talking to this, this radio station because you probably know all the people that I'm referencing, unlike most of the other people that I speak to about this book. Anyway, I am a fan of the work of Anne Labastille, and in Woodswoman, she talks about how the beauty of nature and the peril of nature are really two sides of the same coin. And I understand that sentiment very well, and it sort of drove the book. But yeah, there is a kind of a secondary character loosely based on Garrow who's like hovering in the background of the camp and in both time periods when both children go missing, he's on the loose. So there are questions about whether he could have had something to do with it as well.
Well, one of the great ironies that runs through this whole story is the name of this great camp, that this big estate that the Van Laars live on, and it is
Self-Reliance, which I wanted the title of the book to be as well, but I was overruled. So the Van Laars pride themselves on being big fans of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and the transcendentalists who made the case for being completely self-reliant. But the thing that the local people point out is that there's a great irony in prizing self-reliance in this way because the family is not at all self-reliant. In fact, they are entirely reliant on the labor of the local community, including for the building of the house, which was brought over from Europe. And so a driver on the way bringing a new family member to the compound basically jokes that, it wasn't the Van Laars who moved that lumber, despite the name Self-Reliance. And I think the Van Laars really do value it is sort of, it's incredibly important to them to believe themselves to be self-reliant, but only in ways that they deem acceptable. So they don't want their daughter to be at all self-reliant, for example.
Yeah, there's a self-reliance that's sort of coexisting, if you can, with misogyny.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. I think the women of the book are across all social classes are inhibited by the feeling that the men in their social class don't actually want them to be self-reliant, if it means being defiant at all.
Well, and you mentioned the various social classes. I think one of the other themes that kind of runs throughout this book, and one that might resonate pretty strongly with readers up here, might be income disparity. People sometimes describe the North Country as these little pockets of wealth surrounded by trees and poverty. What were you hoping to explore in that contrast?
Yeah. So income inequality is a theme that comes up a lot in the book. Class, the disparity, the discrepancy between the way that different characters from different classes are treated. It's unfortunately a theme that has only grown and become more relevant as time has gone on because income inequality itself has grown as time has gone on over the past 50 years. I think it does resonate any place where there are people who are working and sort of surviving in a region year round and people who come in for the summer, for example. My perspective is interesting because I have, family history in the region, and my ancestors were local to the community and were working class people within the community. But now, I've never lived there year round. And so I wouldn't call myself a summer person because we come in most seasons, but I certainly am an outsider to the community in other ways. And that's something that, perhaps I was able to write from different perspectives for that reason.
Apologies for this question that now suddenly strikes me as maybe not a question, but I think there's a question at the heart of it. One of the things that strikes me about the Van Laars at least the elder Van Lars. I mean, you mentioned the daughter who goes to the camp, and she is a very interesting and intriguing character. But the men of the Van Lars are not really interesting people. And, what Alice, who marries into the family, goes through is interesting and compelling to read. But on the whole, the picture you paint does not make you want to hang out with these people. As a writer, how challenging was it to develop a family that in some ways is pretty two-dimensional?
Yeah, there's I think every person in the book is facing their own set of challenges. Sometimes it's easier to see what the challenges a person might be facing are if you get a close third point of view on them. So for Alice, who at first seems to be a pretty stereotypical, I don't know, rich lady who's mean to her staff, I wrote, if not from her point of view, I wrote in the close third perspective around her character a lot. And I was able to kind of imagine what her life was like before her marriage into the Van Laar family, and to imagine some motive for why she behaves the way she does today. There are certain characters I couldn't write, whose heads I could not access for reasons that were either personal, like I didn't feel like I could relate to them well, or logistical, like I couldn't write from their perspective because it would give too much away about the mystery. And perhaps those characters are the characters that we know the least, or who feel the least multidimensional in the end. But I will say it is also true that I perhaps have a personal bias against characters like the men of the Van Laar family, who seem to me to value wealth over all else. Yeah.
Well, and I hope that wasn't an insulting question. It just, it's, in some ways, we get this really rich picture of a lot of the characters, and the Van Laar men are almost silhouettes in some ways, and to the benefit of the book, I think.
Yeah, I mean, some of it's necessity. I think as I move forward, this is my fifth novel, and I'm leaning more and more and more into the mystery genre, which means following some of the conventions of that genre that go against, the instincts I would have had when I was a younger writer, including sometimes just letting characters be bad, which is kind of fun, but hopefully not implausible. I do think there are some people who are just bad too, if I'm being honest.
But none of them in the story actually twirls their mustache evilly, as far as I can remember.
No mustache twirling.
Okay.
No, I edited that out.
Why was it important to set this story in both the early 60s and mid 70s? They seem like pivotal times, but maybe you could explain why.
Yeah. So some of it was mathematical. I wanted, I didn't want there to have been too many generations since the creation of the Adirondack Park Preserve, because the first of the Van Laars to settle or to build the house in the region did so upon the creation of the Adirondack Park. And so I wanted him to be a memory that the other characters in the book would have had. And for the working class families, I wanted them to have an ancestral memory of a time before the preserve was created. Also, I just identified the 60s and the 70s as times of great social change in the rest of the country and in the North Country as well. Just maybe not at the Van Laar Preserve itself, because the Van Laars have this vested interest in maintaining the status quo because it serves them. And so I liked the idea that there could be upheaval going on and new ideas trickling in just outside the boundaries of the Van Laar Preserve without it. And I liked to imagine this family like working really, really hard to stave off the social change that was coming in, both from the people who worked for them and from some of the younger members of their own family.
Right. Barbara, the Van Laar's daughter, is into punk rock, for example, which is not something that you can imagine the Van Laar family as a whole really embracing at that point.
She's an early adopter of some pretty alternative music and clothing choices.
The women of the story who are really, I mean, they're really the heroes of the story and in just about every way. They're also at pivotal points in their lives.
That's true. So it is a real ensemble piece in the sense that we get close third person points of view from Alice Van Laar, from Louise, who's a counselor who grows up in the nearby fictional town of Shattuck, which somebody I did an event in Saratoga and somebody was like, Shattuck, that must be Chattagay, right? And I was like, no, I swear it was total coincidence. I just made it up. Anyway, not Chattagay. So Louise has a close third point of view. She's the counselor. There's a character named Tracy, who's a 12-year-old who's coming to camp for the first time, who has a close third point of view. You're right. The majority of the close third points of view are women, with a few exceptions. There's a character named Carl Stoddard, who is a volunteer firefighter, who works on the preserve at the time of the first kid's disappearance. There is the Jacob Sluter character who's kind of modeled on Garrow, and he gets a close third point of view. So I don't know. It's whatever, I don't make, there's no calculus to it. I just kind of start writing in a character's voice and decide if I like writing in from that character's point of view. And also if it's going to reveal too much information that I can't reveal, which sometimes is the case, and then I have to backpedal.
It almost feels in some ways like you're painting kind of miniature coming of age stories about many of these female characters.
Yeah, that's a theme that comes up a lot in my writing. I guess any moment of transition, whether it's, at this point in life, I'm in my early 40s, so I'm transitioning from like being considered young to being considered middle-aged. And that's a transition that I think is coming up a lot in fiction right now, and as is the transition from middle age into being considered elderly, and those just any moment in life where there's a big watershed, where there's a lot of change, makes for good narrative tension and good fiction. So until now, I've written a lot about young people becoming adults. But with the character of Alice, that's kind of like my first foray in writing a character who's approaching middle age and sort of reeling from it. And I imagine that as I get older, my characters might get older as well.
Hopefully you'll make out better than Alice.
Oh my God, yeah. Hopefully we all will.
Yeah.
Without giving anything away.
You mentioned the summer camp that's on these grounds, and of course that's where Barbara disappears. The picture that you paint of camp is an interesting one. For all the wealth that is represented by the campers, you paint a much more sympathetic picture of the kids than of the adults.
Yeah, it was important to me. It is important to me in fiction not to replicate some of the stereotypes I think that exist about young friendship and female friendship in particular. I do think there are mean kids. There always have been, there always will be. But I also think there's a lot of kindness that kids can extend to one another, and a lot of surprising moments of kindness in childhood. And so those were, I wanted to make sure to include those as well.
Yeah, I mean, with Barbara, for example, who is, and I don't think this is giving too much away, really shunned by her family. She could easily, it would be really easy to paint a stereotype and have her shunned by the other campers. But many of them are really drawn to her because she's different.
Yeah, that's right. I think Barbara is different, and under other circumstances, she might be shunned for sure. But here, kids are drawn to her, and the same is true of Tracy, who's not conventionally attractive, and she's certain that she's going to be in exile for the entire summer that she's there at camp. But she ends up finding a nice kind of group of friends, including Barbara.
What about the state police investigator, Udita, or Judy? First of all, was there a real-life early female investigator that you drew on for her character?
Yeah, when I was doing research, I found a real article in, I think, the Times-Union with a photograph with the caption, "Nation's first class of state troopers graduates at Albany." And I think it was in the early 1970s. And I saw pictures of these women. I wasn't lucky enough to talk to any of them, but they became sort of my visual inspiration for the character of Judy, who ends up becoming promoted to investigator, which is the state trooper's term for detective, basically, with the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. And I was able to speak to two different retired investigators who had strong memories of the 1960s and 1970s. They were men, but they were very informative about like what technology would have been used then, what procedures would have been used, et cetera.
Well, and you also, I think you paint an interesting picture of what she would have gone through, which was to say, a fair amount of chauvinism, but it seems like it's of a different class in some ways than, say, what the Van Laar family is dishing out.
Yeah, I didn't want to overdo it. I think she certainly experiences moments of discomfort on the job, but she also is granted access to certain spaces that she might not have been granted access to if she weren't a woman. And so she's able to kind of use that in different ways, especially when speaking with children, because a lot of parents sort of trust a female investigator to speak to their children, their campers, more than they might a man.
Yeah.
And that ends up serving her in a couple moments.
All right, so big picture question here. How do you square this image that you paint of this place, this kind of nuanced but really troubled in a lot of ways, with a place that you have this affection for?
Well, I'm a writer who likes a good story. And so wherever I choose to set a book, there will probably be trouble there. But I think it's, like Anne Labastille said, part of the wonder of the Adirondacks is the idea that they're both beautiful and perilous, and that it is easy to get lost in the woods, metaphorically and physically. And I think that sense of danger really underscores the beauty of it. I feel really lucky to have spent the amount of time that I've spent there. And I know my kids now do too. And hopefully they'll pass that tradition on to their kids if they have any.
You still wish the book were called Self-Reliance?
No, I think The God of the Woods is a better title, after all. I concede.
It is funny. At one point, there are a couple of characters who kind of throw shade at Thoreau.
Yeah. I have to admit that I have mixed emotions about Thoreau, and some of the words coming out of the character's mouth are thoughts that I too have had.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. I'll let readers read to find the quote and to decide whether they agree or disagree. But I have mixed thoughts on Thoreau.
It's a weird way to end an interview, but
Mixed thoughts on Thoreau.
Well, listen, Liz Moore, it's an amazing book. It was difficult to put down. So congratulations on really a terrific achievement.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Liz Moore is the author of The God of the Woods. We first spoke with her last summer when the book came out. So what is your favorite first line of a novel, or any book for that matter? We'd love to hear about it. You can get in touch by visiting ncpr.org/northwards, or just sending me an email directly at mitch@ncpr.org. You could also send Ethan an email. Ethan Shanty is here with the first line of our closing credits and all the lines that follow.
Okay. Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, produced, and edited by Mitch Teich, with digital production supervision by me. I'm Ethan Shanty. You can write to me, ethan@ncpr.org. To find more of these conversations and to support this show, head to ncpr.org/northwards. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.